Welcome back, everybody, to Just Keep Parenting. It's a snappy new day today. So glad that you could join us for a couple of minutes about our neighborhoods and how we can rebuild our neighborhood, right? Last week I returned from a conference in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, Mr. Rogers, and it was a conference about his context and legacy. And so that's kind of what I'm going to do for the next little bit, is just talk about all the things that I learned at the conference regarding rebuilding neighborhoods and parenting, as well as take some thoughts from the book that I talked about last week, which is called When You Wonder, You're Learning. So as I posted last week, one of the questions that I asked on the social media platform was, what are you doing? What are you doing to build your neighborhood, right? So I've been thinking about that, and what am I doing, right, in my little sphere of influence? I've shared this week with a lot of people when Art Miller, who was at the conference, he teaches at Faulkner University, he teaches music there, and one of the things that he talked about was when he was on the set with Mr. Rogers and said to him, how do I do what you're doing? How do I broadcast? How do I do this? And Mr. Rogers looked at him and he said, never underestimate the power of narrowcasting, right? Not broadcasting. He'd been called to the ministry, he was doing that, but what can we do to narrowcast? What do we do in our little circle of influence, in that sphere of influence that we have influence over, right? And so a couple of thoughts about that. Fred Rogers said, there isn't anyone in this world who couldn't become a more sensitive listener. And essentially, that's what we're called to be. Listening is where love begins, listening to ourselves and then to our neighbor. That was at a speech for the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts back in 1991. And I just think about, wow, 1991, and here we are in 2023, and how much we still need that, right? Listening is where love begins, listening to ourselves and then to our neighbor. So I've been thinking about, what am I doing in my neighborhood to listen, right? And one of my neighbors came over last week, and I could just tell he needed to talk. And so I was like, I got this to do, and I got this to do. And I just thought, you need to put that away, Dory. You need to be a better listener, right? A more sensitive listener, not just better, but more sensitive to what was happening in his life. As we've had Independence Day celebrations this week, right? And people in my home, and I've been in people's homes. I've tried to be more cognizant of this listening skill, because listening typically rolls forward into love. And so love is not a bad thing, right? And so as we listen more sensitively, we love better. He said, Mr. Rogers again, I was not just a songwriter or a language buff or a student of human development or a telecommunicator, but someone who could use every talent that had ever been given to me in the service of children and their families. It's a miracle when you finally discover whom you're best equipped to serve. And we're all equipped to serve in some way. So there again, going back to rebuilding our neighborhoods, right? What are you doing in your neighborhood that is rebuilding, that is listening, that is helping, right? Go to the helpers. I was listening to another podcast today, and the podcast visitor was talking about how she's always told her children, find a lady with a stroller, right? If you're ever lost, if you're ever in trouble, look for the lady in the stroller. Look for the lady with the stroller. And I just thought, that's right. That's the helper, right? Go to the moms, right? Find a mom with a stroller. Anyway, I just was reminded again, that's how we can help rebuild our neighborhoods, right? Another quote by Mr. Rogers, love is at the root of everything. All learning, all parenting, all relationships. Love, or the lack of it. So, I went to one of our plenary sessions, was given by a professor of back at Harvard. His name is Junlin Lee. And he said, so much of Fred doesn't happen in our heads. It happens in dialogue, in friendship, right? He talked about what being a helpful appreciator means, because we all want to be helpers. Most of us want to be helpers, right? But a helpful appreciator. So I've been thinking about that concept, a helpful appreciator, right? How do I appreciate others? Because if I'm appreciating others, then I'm being helpful and trying to rebuild that neighborhood. One of the things that June Lee talked about was the variability in children's vocabulary research is typically determined by three things. Number one is the quality of their interactions, right? If children have a lot of interactions and a lot of good quality interactions, then their vocabulary increases. The second thing was the quantity of words, right? How many words that they're introduced to. And then the third thing was other factors. And so we were concentrating on those first two, right? The quality of their interactions and the quantity of words that they're exposed to. So I was just thinking about that. And last week, I was out in my backyard watering, and I get a phone call from a panicked neighbor who said, I'm not home right now, but my kids are saying there's a grease fire. So I run out the front door, and the kids are coming across the street saying, "Do we need your help? We need your help." So I run across, and the house is filled with smoke, right? We get the grease outside, and we start looking for fans. We get all the fans on, all the windows open. And I just kept thinking about all the things as we were sitting outside. What are the things that we're talking about, right? The quality of our interactions as neighbors, the quantity of words that we were using as we were just sitting out there waiting for the house to kind of clear out. The mother called and she said, "Dora, you don't need to stay with them." And I'm like, no, I'm having a good time with them, right? That's that interaction, that helpful appreciator. So I finally said to the kids, we can either sit here or we can go play some b-ball. And they're like, "You play b-ball with us?" I'm like, "Yeah, where's the basketball? Let's play some games." So we played horse and just had a great time, right? As we were having that really great interaction of something that was pretty scary in their life as children. Having a grease fire, I can't even imagine, right? How scary it would be. And not having an adult that would be home, that was home at the time. And so having those people, right, in our lives that we feel like we can call on in our neighborhoods. I need a ride to an airport, right? Reached out to a neighbor today and said, "Are you available? I know it's early, but I need a ride to the airport." She's like, "Would love to take you," right? And so preparing those opportunities so that we can be listeners, so that we can be appreciators, so that we can be good neighbors. Fred Rogers said, "Parents can set the example by just being themselves rather than trying to be perfect parents." I think sometimes in our neighborhoods we're trying to keep up with the Joneses. Or sometimes we're in our neighborhoods we're like, "Oh gosh, I wish I was more like them," or "I wish I had that kind of money," or I wish, right? Rather than looking at the here and now and saying, what do I have to offer? What do I have to give somebody rather than trying to compare, right? June Lee went on to say, "At the core of everyone is someone wonderful. The greatest thing we can do is to find out what is healthy and laudable about so-and-so and reflect that back to them." Wouldn't that be amazing if that's what we were doing in our neighborhoods, right? Even in our families, in that smaller unit. At the core of everyone is someone wonderful. Sometimes we don't see the wonderfulness, right? The greatest thing we can do is to find out what is healthy and laudable about that person and reflect it back to them. There's been a couple of times as I've been ruminating about these thoughts in my brain that have stayed with me since the conference. Even just at the barbecue the other day, at the Independence Day barbecue, there was something that came up about somebody, and I thought, I know something about that somebody, but that's not healthy and laudable about that person. And so I thought, I need to just stop, right? That's hard for me to do, right? But I'm so grateful that I have these thoughts that Mr. Rogers has shared with us, and now I can share them with others. I can make them a part of me. June Lee talked a lot about each one of us is so much more than any one thing. And that's what I was thinking about when that situation happened this week. I thought, this person is more than this. So why am I sharing with this? We were talking, in the conference, we were talking about the opioid epidemic, right? And how we tend to look at those people as like, well, they shouldn't have gotten into that. You know, we have these judging eyes, these judging thoughts. And if each one of us is so much more than any one thing, the thought was presented that an opioid mother then is more than her addiction, right? I'm more than things that people may perceive as bad, as wrong. I'm more than that, because that's just a little piece of who I am. So I've been trying to think about when I have those thoughts, those negative thoughts that come in about somebody or something. I'm like, but they're more than that, right? What do I know that's healthy and laudable about that person? And I just feel like I've always really loved my neighborhood, but I feel like this last 2 weeks I've been able to look through a different lens, through maybe a Mr. Rogers lens, if you will, and see my neighbors as better. And I think if we could all do that in our neighborhoods, in our families, then I think that we have a better chance of being happy, of having others being happy around us, right? Of listening, being better listeners, of loving. And the last thing that June Lee left us with that has been percolating in my brain is 20 years ago, right? Fred passed away. It's already been 20 years. What will happen in the next 20 years? It's not just nostalgia, right? We're not just having, oh, I just love that Mr. Rogers, right? There's a piece of that. But then he said, those ideas still matter. And that is why we're continuing to talk about Fred Rogers and the feelings that we had and the quotes that he said. And he's not just going to go away. He made a difference in people's lives. He can still make a difference in people's lives if we start in our little spheres of influence, right? In our families, and take it to the neighborhood. So I would love to hear in your comments, what are you doing? What are you doing to rebuild your neighborhood? To rebuild, maybe that neighborhood is your family, right? And just remembering that we're just keeping on. We're just going to keep on doing what we're doing a little bit better each day, and remembering that we're all helpers, and we all need helpers in our families and our neighborhoods. So just keep parenting, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Hope this has sparked some thoughts in what you're already doing as a good neighbor, and what we can beef up just a little bit more, even if it's just in our thoughts and what we're thinking about people. So just keep parenting. Make it a great weekend.